All right, well, welcome everyone to the final, it's bittersweet, the final lecture in our 2023 URI Cooperative Extension Plugged into URI Energy Research Lecture Series. I see some diehards in the crowd who are here with us every time and some new folks. Thank you so much for coming in person, those of you I'm looking at. It's kind of a different world now. So speaking of which, we have a live stream going right now. There's a camera over there. If you see it moving around, that means it's on you. So just be mindful of that. You know what I mean? But I will introduce myself first. My name is Kate Hardesty. I am a program administrator, but more importantly, extension educator here at URI. And I think 8 years ago, in conversations with Campaign and others in energy, we kind of realized that there was a unique opportunity for us here at URI to make sure that some of the more complex topics, if you will, in the energy worlds were accessible to people who are not coming here and sitting in classes. And so we developed this lecture series, I think 8 years ago. This is the 7th one, so we skipped a year. And we've had a lot of wonderful speakers, both from the land-grant university system and also from the energy business sector, others who work for NGOs, a lot of wicked smart people, as we say in Rhode Island. So that is true tonight also. We're going to talk about this topic that we're calling Wired for the Future, Navigating the Path to Electrification. Really simple, straightforward. So thank you again for being here at our new Higgins Welcome Center. And I always, as folks who have been here before know well, I always take this opportunity to share a little bit about what cooperative extension is and why I've dedicated my career to it. How many of you are familiar with the mission of extension? Okay, thank you. For those of you who are not, we are in a tiny state here without a lot of agriculture, and so extension isn't really that well known, but it is responsible for, our mission is to make sure that the scientific resources of the land-grant university, which is URI here in Rhode Island, UVM in Vermont, Rutgers in New Jersey, etc., are that those scientific findings make it out to the public, people that don't traditionally come to university to learn. And so this is an example of some programming that we do under our energy literacy area of focus, but we also have programming around land stewardship, water resources, healthy lifestyles, things like the 4-H program, and food systems and agriculture, which is really where we were born from. So we've been around for 100 years. We have really great relationships with partners all across Rhode Island and really across the United States. And so it's a pleasure to still be doing this work in the age of the internet. And speaking of, I won't read these guiding principles, but one thing, bless you, I'd ask each of you is that if there's someone in your life or 10 people in your life who would benefit from any of this information, even a small part, let them know how to access it, because we want to make sure that we are reaching everyone who cares to learn. And it's hard to do that. So thank you in advance for helping us. You will receive, after tonight, an email either from Caitlin or I, with a link to a survey. I say this every time. We love you so much for filling the survey out. We read every single one we receive, and the information you share, candidly or otherwise, is what informs us not only of future topics, but just, how effective was this particular program on your own information gathering. So the last thing I'll say is we are recording this session. It is live on YouTube, but we're also recording it. And once that recording is available from our friend James in the back. We will upload it to our YouTube channel where it'll be closed captions and you can access it and watch it every weekend forever. So I would like to introduce my colleague Lexi Zabo, who is our 2023 URI Cooperative Extension Energy Literacy Fellow. Can you raise your hand if you're an Energy Fellow in the room? Some of you may be familiar with the Energy Fellows program. We are training the next generation of critically minded, professional, passionate energy leaders. And so Lexi is one of them. She's going to give us a few words and then we'll welcome Sue.
Thank you. Thanks. Hi. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Lexi Zabo. I am the 2023 Energy Fellow for Cooperative Extension at URI. I would like to begin by taking a moment to thank our 2023 Energy Fellows sponsors. Our 2023 kilowatt sponsor is Vineyard Wind, and our megawatt sponsor is Rise Engineering. Their continued support for the Energy Fellows program does not go unnoticed, as it provides us with many networking and professional development opportunities. If you are interested in learning more about sponsoring the Energy Fellows program or this lecture series, please see Kate or Caitlin. And now I would like to introduce our moderator for this evening. Sue Anderbaugh is the Director of Climate and Government Relations for the Nature Conservancy in Rhode Island. Sue is also a member of the Energy Efficiency and Resource Management Council, representing the environmental community. Outside of work, Sue also serves on the Providence City Council and is chair of their Special Committee on the Environment and Resiliency. Please welcome Sue Anderbaugh.
Hi, everybody. I was told to put this very close to my face, and so I will. This is also for you all to remember to put it close to your face. It's a real honor to be here moderating this panel of three really amazing people, so I will be quick. They'll each speak for about 15 minutes. And our first one will be Charles, but they'll speak for about 15 minutes. For our speakers, at about 10 minutes, I'll give you a 5-minute warning. I'll be moderating, and then if you go over, I reserve the right to use the buzzer that Kaylin sillily gave me. So just because we want to make sure that we reserve time at the end for questions. So we will be holding all questions until the end. We'll hear from all three speakers who are going to be fantastic, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. So without further ado, it's my honor to introduce Charles, who is the policy analyst at Rewiring America. Previously, Charles supported clean energy investment efforts with Generate Capital. He developed clean energy projects with Avangrid and analyzed climate policies with the Clean Energy States Alliance. While in college at Harvard University, he helped develop and write his university's sustainability plan, served on its sustainability committee, and organized energy conferences. So really excited to welcome you up here, Charles. Thank you so much.
I'm going to try to see if this works. Is this better? Great. Well, thanks, Sue, for that kind introduction, and thanks to the University of Rhode Island Cooperative Extension for having me. It's an honor to be here. So I'm excited to share a little bit today about this phrase, electrify everything. Electrification is an increasingly hot-button topic, and so today, hopefully, we're going to try to break that down and what that kind of really is getting at. So first, I'll touch a little bit about the challenge in terms of why we need electrification, then dive into the opportunity, share a little bit about what Rewiring America is doing in that space, and then dive into some of the policies and incentives at play with electrification. So first, the challenge. As many folks in this crowd know, we're not on track to meet the Paris Agreement goals of achieving about 50% emissions reductions by 2030, by the end of the decade. Even with the IRA, that gets us to about 40% reductions, but there's still that gap that remains. The vast majority of our emissions come from the energy system, and of that, 42% comes from decisions that everybody makes around the kitchen table. From the cars that we drive, to how we heat our homes and water, to how we cook our food, wash your dishes, dry your clothes, generate electricity, etc. So that's a lot of machines across the country, and a lot of efforts that need to be taken from rooftop solar installations to the stoves in your homes, to the dryers, the batteries, water heaters, vehicles, etc. Combined, that adds up to 1 billion machines across this country. So to think about this task of if we want to achieve an emissions-free economy by mid-century, there's 1 billion machines that need to be cleaned up, that are going to need to be replaced or installed by 2050. Now, part of the challenge is that a lot of folks in the country have never heard of either the term electrification or the term the IRA. And if we want to get to every machine in the country being efficient and electric by 2050, that means that 100% of sales are going to need to be electric much sooner than that. It's actually closer to around a decade from now, in the early 2030s, if you think about the curves. So the left shows you sales, the right shows you stock. So if you, just from this kind of modeling exercise, you see that if you want to achieve 100% of the machines in your stock being fully electric and efficient by 2050, that means that by about 2033, so again, about a decade from today, we're going to need to make sure that every machine, or close to every machine, is electric. So just this year alone, across all these technologies, that means that there's going to be about 1.5 million new electrification events. So what is that exactly? That's heat pump HVAC sales, that's heat pump water heater sales, that's EV sales, that's rooftop solar installations, induction stove sales, etc. You get the point. A lot of appliances in our homes that are currently powered by fossil fuels, and if we want to get to, again, that clean, efficient future, these are all the actions that are underway this year, estimated. Now, is that fast enough? I think folks in the audience know that the answer is no. If you look at this sort of bottom line figure, what that's essentially saying is that business as usual, if nothing really were to change from a policy or behavioral standpoint, if we just kept on the current trajectory that we're at now, over these next 3 years until 2025, we're going to, across these 5 key appliances and devices and machines, have about 13 million. Now, to actually hit our climate target, again, net zero emissions by mid-century, we're going to need to go twice as fast. So that kind of builds this sort of idea of just the challenge that we're currently facing and just how far behind we are in that race. So what's the opportunity here? So we spoke a little bit about the challenge, framing kind of why electrification is really important, but what's the opportunity? Well, it's a big one, in part because we know how to generate clean electricity. States like Rhode Island, many states throughout New England have paved the way through renewable portfolio standard policies over the years. We know how to do that. And the good thing is it's affordable, abundant, cheap, clean, etc. Electric appliances, machines, and devices are often faster, more precise, more efficient, but in one word, better. They're, for example, electric vehicles they drive smoother, they're easier to maintain, they cost less. Heat pumps are more efficient. Induction stoves are better for your health. They're easier to clean, they're quicker. And it creates jobs. The good thing about these jobs, too, is that they can't be offshored almost by definition. And what that means is that brings community investment, reinvestment, and also ensures that wealth and money actually stays in communities. So that that wealth isn't being exported or isn't coming elsewhere, but it's actually in communities themselves. There's a health angle to this at the personal human level. A lot of studies show that having a gas stove in your house is like living with a smoker. It contains hazardous air pollutants in terms of the natural gas. Children have a higher risk of asthma. There have been a lot of well-documented studies around this. And for something like a stove, it's leaking those pollutants even when it's turned off. So it's not just when you're using the stove, but even kind of in an idle state, it's generating that indoor air pollution. And it's not just at the individual household level, it's also at the macro economy-wide level where air pollution is particularly costly. It's deadly. So if we eliminate that pollution, we could prevent somewhere around 50,000 premature deaths per year, $600 billion in health benefits. And the economic toll of that is substantial. So what are some of the barriers to actually getting this done? Well, I've labeled three kind of main categories. So one is financial barriers. So a lot of these electric machines, they're not inherently cheap. So sometimes they have high upfront costs. There might not be flexible financing options for a broad enough base of customers to be able to adopt these technologies. There's policy and regulatory barriers, which we'll touch on a little bit. Inequitable policies, split incentives for renters, for example. Permitting challenges. There's this thing called the obligation to serve for many utilities, misaligned utility incentives, etc. And then I kind of cheated and lumped everything else into this other barriers category, which is anything from workforce shortages to contractor inavailabilities. Anybody who's probably tried to get a heat pump probably has not had the smoothest ride so far, and there's maybe other technological upgrades that are necessary. So what do we do about that? So, there's what I like to call the 3 Ps, kind of policy, programs, and practices. Starting with policies, there's many different ways to think about this. One is rates and rate reform. So the way that we've structured our rates in this country for many states does not align the marginal cost of production with the price that you pay for electricity. And that creates these skewed incentives for electrification. So oftentimes, rate reform is a very useful measure, and I'm happy to talk about that in more detail. There's something called time of use pricing. So rather than just paying the same price for each unit of electricity, regardless of when you're using it, you'll be charged based on how costly it is to the grid, or et cetera. There's also standards. So building performance standards, appliance standards. Basically, folks have heard of Energy Star, right? That's at the appliance level. So changing the standards. And then changing the rules. So things like building code, zoning, permitting requirements, etc. That's policies. Programs, financing, right? I touched about some of the financing challenges, creating flexible options. I touched on some bottlenecks. And then practices, we need more innovation in this space. I'll touch a little bit on what those terms mean, distributed energy resources and virtual power plants. There's education component to this, educating consumers, contractors, policymakers, regulators about electrification. And there's also data issues, right? As we have more of these kind of digitized appliances talking to each other, there's issues around transparency, data access, measurement, et cetera. So I'll go super quick into, so I'm here representing Rewiring America, into some of the work that Rewiring does. So Rewiring was founded a couple years ago with a simple idea to electrify everything. And the sort of origin story is one around community renewal, economic renewal, and community infrastructure to build a new climate future so that you lower energy costs, you create healthier homes, and you benefit the climate as sort of the cherry on top. So some folks may have seen this. It's the IRA savings calculator. If you go onto the website, it tells you what incentives that you have available at your disposal with the Inflation Reduction Act. Here's kind of a picture of what that looks like in practice. You just type in your zip code, income, tax filings, homeowner status, etc., and it tells you all the incentives that you have available to you. Since this was launched, about 500,000 Americans have used this tool. There's guides around how you can electrify everything in your home. And even more than that, what's coming soon is what's called the personal electrification planner. So similar concept, you type in some attributes about your home, and it'll spit out a personalized step-by-step plan with a sequencing and an order of operations for how you can electrify all your appliances. Here's kind of a mock-up of what that looks like. It'll tell you what order to do what. Doing some work around kind of consumer education and awareness. We're doing things with communities, right? Working with about 5 communities across the country in Oklahoma, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Oregon to help them set electrification goals and implement pilot projects. And we're also working with mayors, city council members, and city-level staff across the country with about 200 plus such folks to help create local policies to support electrification. So that's kind of to get to this part, which is what are the policies and incentives at play here, right? So I shared a little bit about that calculator. What are those? Well, one way to think about it is an electric wallet. So because of the IRA, every household has a bank account now with thousands of dollars to go electric. Most folks just don't know about it. I think some of these slides didn't make it in, but I'll just kind of talk about that, I guess. So there's what's called a home energy rebates program. It's intended for low and moderate income customers below 150% area median income threshold, where every state who opted in for that program, Rhode Island certainly did, will receive, starting as early as later this year, but likely 2024, funding from the Department of Energy to set up these programs. And so there's also tax credits, which folks can claim starting today. And those tax credits are meant for whether you're thinking about a heat pump or heat pump water heater or electric stove or electric vehicle or rooftop solar. Again, there's a laundry list of technologies that you can electrify and think about as part of your personal electrification journey, where there are tax credits available starting today. And again, the purpose of the calculator is the IRA is sort of this really complicated, thorny, it can be this very complicated, thorny, messy bill. So how do you actually break that down and make that personal and tangible? So I think I'll close. I had a slide kind of summarizing this, but I think what I'll close with is just kind of going back to paint sort of a picture around this opportunity, this moment. When we think about a clean energy future, I think it's very easy to kind of picture a bunch of sort of far off wind farms or solar panels, utility scale solar projects somewhere. And the question of, okay, where do I fit into this clean energy transition often doesn't quite make it to the center of the discussion. But in fact, going back to that 42% statistic, that's not quite true, because the pathway to a climate future that has climate stabilization that achieves net zero emissions by 2050 actually runs through American homes. So this is a story of economic opportunity, wealth building, community reinvestment, healthier homes, clean energy, etc. And so I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions during the Q&A and dive deeper into any of the policies, provisions, etc.
Awesome job, Charles. Also, you came in within 1 second, so that was like very impressive timing. I'm really excited to introduce our next speaker. I'm going to put up his photo here. This is Charles's contact info for anyone who wants to write it down at home. I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, who I've been a fan of for many, many years. Rich Sedano is the CEO of the Regulatory Assistance Project, otherwise known as RAP. RAP is a global organization of energy policy experts working mostly in the United States, China, Europe, and India, so everywhere. At RAP, they work with decision makers in government to improve climate and social outcomes from energy production and energy use. Rich was a commissioner of the Vermont Public Service Department, here it's called the PUC, from 1991 to 2001 before joining RAP. So thank you so much, Rich, and welcome on up.
Hi, everyone. Charles, that was a great presentation, and I'm going to skip over a few things that I was going to say that would be redundant to what you said. And what I do want to focus on is the parts of the energy transition that run through the Public Utilities Commission, which is an important gateway which can either accelerate or decelerate the energy transition. And the energy transition is a global phenomenon. It's not just something that is happening in one place or another. And I'm happy to be here. I had a career in Vermont. I live in Providence now. I have for the last 11 years, so I'm still a new person. In Vermont, you're not a Vermonter until you're a third generation, so I'm trained to not presume too much. But I'm trying to learn the state, and this program will give me an opportunity to do that. But I did have a little bit of prior experience having been at Brown a long time ago. I want to tell you about the new house, which is really going to show you how Charles is totally right, that the road to the energy transition goes through our houses. So this is a house. It looks like a regular house, but there are a lot of things about it that are different. One thing is that it has a up-to-date and currently and constantly improving energy code. It does more than just the windows and the insulation. It does things that are going to prepare the house for all of the electrification that's going to happen. So a lot of things that are going to happen in the wiring. It's going to have a heat pump system with efficient heat exchangers. And I want to dwell on just for a moment, the coefficient of efficiency of heat pumps is 3, 4, 5 times. Some people think, well, you can't create energy. You're not creating energy. It's important to appreciate that you're moving energy from where you don't want it to where you want it, or the other way. It works like a refrigerator. It moves energy, and the more efficient these exchangers are, the more compelling they're going to be as investments and as additions to our houses. In the summer, when it gets cool, there might be ice storage. Now, ice storage is an interesting addition, which depends on something else that Charles talked about, which is reform of the way we pay for electricity, reform of the time when we use electricity and when we pay for it. Sometimes it costs a lot to generate, sometimes it doesn't cost that much. Current rates don't differentiate. A time-dependent rate does. And so when you have a smart thermostat in your house that can drive the entire energy system inside the house, it can benefit us if we are using more electricity when it costs less and less electricity when it costs more. And all of this can be automated and can include not just the heating system for the space, but the heating system for the water. And to the extent that we can produce our own electricity, either right on the house or nearby, and I think not all houses have this capacity, but in many cases there can be community programs that share electricity that are produced centrally within the neighborhood. And some of that can be stored, and this is another reason why rate reform is a good idea, because at some times when there's a lot of electricity being produced because it's a brilliantly sunny day or a very windy day, we have both of those sometimes, more wind maybe than sun in Rhode Island, the batteries can store these things and provide us some backup electricity in case there's a problem with the grid while doing it. In Vermont, there's a program where the system operator, the people who operate the grid behind the scenes that you never hopefully really think about, can actually use your batteries, use the batteries today of thousands of Vermonters to store electricity and then discharge it when it's good for the grid. This is the kind of program that I think we're going to want to be seeing everywhere and will be motivated by rate reform. And the same with vehicles. Smart charging is seen by a lot of experts as essential to meet the kind of targets that Charles talked about, because in that way we'll actually lower the cost of electricity even further and allow our utilities to start to use the charging process as a resource itself. what we have to start seeing perhaps is where resources. It's not just a wind machine out in the water or even the solar panels on the buildings. Each one of us is potentially a resource. And these kinds of ideas are going to demonstrate how. We'll have smart appliances as well that will also be price responsive and being still connected to the grid. Some people say, well, with all these tools, why don't we just disconnect from the grid? I'll just take care of my own needs. But the idea of sharing all these resources with everyone else increases their value immeasurably and allows you to then benefit to the extent that you can provide resources to the grid that the grid needs. So this is the smart house, and so now I'm going to talk a little bit about building electrification. A lot of greenhouse gases come from buildings, 13%. This is a chart that shows that from the EPA that shows that 25% of greenhouse gases come from electric power, and of course some of that is supporting buildings. But the heat pumps are more efficient than boilers, as you've seen, and as the grid gets cleaner, and every year the grid is getting cleaner, the more wind and solar is coming on the grid. So every year the electricity we use is actually cleaner than it was last year. Now, one program that I wanted to underscore before getting into some other things is that many people, when they have a gas boiler or furnace in their house, replace it when there's a failure, when there's water on the floor, and when the guy who comes, who you've trusted for years to come and inspect your unit, comes and says, well, I'll give you a new one of these exact ones, like that's what I know how to do, that's what is best for you. If you put yourself in that situation, that's certainly a sensible thing. But if you have a boiler or a furnace that's approaching what you might think of as a life expectancy, 12, 15, 18 years, you're not very many years away from that moment of failure. And so what I think we're going to start hearing about more is programs, and this is where the PUC might be very important, to encourage people to replace their energy systems before you're in a panic, before you're in a crisis, but when there's an opportunity to really think about the options for the next 20 years or 30 years in your building. So replacement before failures is one thing that I hope you'll take away from this. Now, PUCs are important because important decisions about how we pay for critical infrastructure, how we pay for important resources that come into our houses, electricity, gas, other things. These are hashed out at the PUC based on evidence. And we know that there are important ways that electrification are going to happen. And some of those are going to be because those of us who have the resources can actually pay for a heat pump system, can pay for a water heater ourselves. But not everybody can do that. There are a lot of buildings, and you can name a lot of neighborhoods where that most of the people who live there are just not going to do that. And they need some guidance, they need some support to help them pay for these things. We have energy efficiency programs. We know how to do that. In fact, Rhode Island is among the leaders in the United States and even in the world in deploying energy efficiency. We need to think about applying that same know-how to electrify our buildings. Financing, Charles mentioned, there's a lot of different ways that people are thinking about paying for stuff as it's being used. You're saving money along the way, but you can either create on-bill financing through the utility, helped by a public interest credit union or bank, or through the property taxes. Property assessed financing is especially likely to be attractive for commercial customers. And we're seeing more and more of that happening across the United States, but it's not fast enough, but I want to call attention to it. So participants who are going to just be able to pay for these things, either with their existing funds or with financing, is one part of the picture. But we expect that our utilities, through the PUC programs, are going to help us because we've learned that works for energy efficiency. And if we rely on the PUC, we're going to be confronted with the point that cost effectiveness is important. And income sensitivity can be layered onto cost effective programs. So we have to demonstrate how electrification is going to be cost effective. Now, the third group of people, which sometimes are people that think of as the same as electric customers, are taxpayers, to the extent that legislatures create tax advantages for all of these investments. That's all well and good. Maybe they'll do that. I think Lexi wanted me to come here to talk about beneficial electrification, which is different from electrify everything. Beneficial electrification calls attention to the fact that the way we as a society invest in electrification has to take into account many other social matters aside from climate. Climate is hair on fire important, but so is all kinds of other things that our legislators deal with. And so beneficial electrification affirmatively says, yes, sustainable policy means that we're considering a full range of social concerns as we think about electrification. And externalities, things that markets overlook, like health benefits, need to be considered. Today, when you go to the PUC to talk about even energy efficiency programs, health benefits are not included. Is that a good idea? We just heard about how many health issues are associated with indoor air quality, associated with internal inside the house combustion. Perhaps they should be. There are a number of ways to think about how we heat the buildings. But bottom line is decarbonizing heat is essential. And when we think about that, we have to think about, well, what about the gas companies? The gas companies across the U.S., which have served the United States well for a long time, are faced with an existential issue. In Britain, they have decided to regulate heat, and that includes regulated providers like the gas company and unregulated providers like fuel oil dealers that deliver fuels. But what happens to the gas companies? Well, we can rely on markets, we can rely on individual choices to convert gas appliances and fuel oil appliances to electrification equipment. And my concern about that is that the last ones on are going to be paying for the whole system. And that's scary to me. I also wonder how we are going to support safety when that happens. Another approach, which I think some people feel is more logical, is to, first of all, accept that we're going to contract the gas system and start pruning the gas system in ways that are more organized, with the long-term objective of closing it. The gas companies would like us to consider substituting low-carbon fuels. And there are a lot of issues related to this, which I allude to here in the slides. There's limited supplies and cost issues. There's a few other options that we think about to motivate the gas companies to innovate. One is to create a clean heat standard, basically to tell the gas company, you're going to decarbonize, you're telling us, your government relations people are telling us that decarbonization is possible. Well, we're going to give you a declining standard over time to meet. And if you meet it, great. And if you don't meet it, you're going to be penalized significantly. Another approach to think about is to just use the gas companies' right-of-ways and distribution system and convert it to distribution of hot water. District energy is working in many places in the world today. It's not so popular in the United States. It's being tested right now in a community in Massachusetts. It's viable. It tends to use both ground source energy and electrified industrial scale heat pumps to provide the energy for district energy. And we have a report on this that shows how that would work. And several states around Massachusetts, Maryland, Oregon, Colorado, and Oregon are looking at this approach. And this is a picture of how a hot water distribution system, 140, 150 degree water circulating. But the structural issues is that we think of gas and electricity separately. And that is a structural problem because you all consume energy. Our regulators are focusing on gas on the one hand and electricity on the other. And as long as that happens, we're not going to be considering the overall societal effects of many of these choices. So, in conclusion, decarbonizing buildings is primarily about heat. Beneficial electrification tries to consider everything. The obvious path would be to shrink gas distribution, but perhaps the gas companies can find a second life, and the PUC's role is pivotal in answering these questions. Thanks.
Awesome. That was amazing. Um, Last but not least, I'm very excited to introduce Kat Burnham, who I've also been a fan of for a very long time, and you all will be too after tonight if you aren't already. Kat Burnham promotes policies that encourage and advance energy adoption and serves as the state lead for Advanced Energy United's advocacy work in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. She also facilitates Advanced Energy United's Public Utility Commission engagement efforts and develops strategies to improve wholesale markets. Prior to Advanced Energy United, Kat researched renewable energy programs and barriers to consumer adoption in academic settings, as well as nonprofit organizations. And she's a fantastic person and a great speaker. So here she is.
Thank you. All right, I just want to say thank you to URI for having me, and thank you to the fellows for all the things that you do, and to my panelists. I was nodding my head like a bobblehead, agreeing with everything they were saying. So I just want to quickly introduce Advanced Energy United. We are a clean energy trade association, so we represent a range of technologies. We represent the batteries, the wind, the grid enhancing technologies, all different kinds of clean energy technology types, and we're united in our goal to achieve 100% clean energy across the country. And as Sue said, my role is focused here in New England, looking at state level issues, working with legislatures, working with PUCs, working with elected officials, and making sure that good policies come into practice. So just want to level set here. The other speakers focus a bit on the consumer side and the end users. I want to talk about how we get there and talk a little bit about the grid. I think I took the wired part of the talk today a little literally, but bear with me. So first, want to just have an orienting slide, the obligatory why are we here, why do we care? The climate is changing, the data is clear. We know that fossil fuels are contributing to extreme weather events, and not to mention, it's also, I have the Henry Hub graph here to demonstrate how volatilely priced it can be. There are all kinds of costs associated with our fossil fuel heavy economy. And as Rich mentioned, there's a lot of concerns, especially for us in New England, because we are addicted to our methane gas consumption. In New England, our rates go up not in the summer when demand is high for electricity, but in the winter because we rely on gas, not just for heating, but also for electricity predominantly. And we're really putting all of our eggs in the fossil gas basket, which is really risky. In terms of our reliability issues, not to mention all of the climate impacts associated with methane, and not to mention some of the issues Rich touched on with regards to equity concerns in the transition. So really important that we think about how we look at a future where there's energy diversity. And also want to just acknowledge, if we maintain the status quo, that is the most expensive option. That is approaching things piecemeal, one by one. It leaves communities behind. It is, a way of, not having a comprehensive look at our energy system. We can do things a lot better when we look at a holistic view of our energy consumption and all the different technologies we can use. We certainly won't hit our clean energy targets if we don't change our approach to how we plan for energy and how we procure it. So enter distributed energy resources. So DERs, as we know them to be, it's generating sources like wind and solar. It's also some of the devices that Charles and Rich talked about, your electric vehicles, your heat pumps. They are resources that can produce energy as well as manage your consumption of it. So really interesting things. And working together, these resources can reduce or shift our demand, which is really important, from the expensive peak periods of the day to other areas of the day, which help us save on our energy costs. That's important for improving reliability and affordability for consumers, and as was mentioned before, creates local jobs, and it also improves the comfort and control over your home. I have a very old home, I just want to say, and I'm so excited to update my thermostat and to get a heat pump and have better control over my temperature in the house rather than my steam vent. So it is what it is. I'm not going to talk too long about building electrification and transportation electrification that was touched on earlier by our speakers, but I really want to echo the point that these are not passive assets anymore. These are active tools that we can use to manage our energy consumption. So instead of being energy gobblers, these are things that we can use to reduce our consumption or shift it to places that are, less peaky during the day that can be expensive. These are tools that can accelerate the clean energy transition. So we know the future that we want, but how do we get there? We need to shift from proposal to practice. And the good news is there are good policies in place. As has been mentioned, Rhode Island has a very strong renewable energy standard. We look fabulous compared to our neighbors. It's always great to see. New England as a whole is pretty good on clean energy, but we have an ambitious renewable portfolio standard. But it's an issue of, we have the devices and we have the goals, but how do we actually get the power through the wires to the places they need to be? So enabling this clean energy transition means we really need to reform our grid. And the two things I want to talk about today focus on transmission, which is looking at the wholesale markets. How do we get power from where it's generated to where it's consumed? And interconnection, which is essentially plugging it into the grid. How do we get these resources online so that they can serve our electricity demand? And so these issues are really wonky. If you have a conversation with me at a party, I'll bring up energy policy. I'm sorry, we are going to get into the wonk today. And so these issues span local distribution level markets. So that's the poles and wires that reach your houses, to the wholesale stuff, which are the big cables and poles that you'll see on the highways, for example. So bird's eye view, we in New England are part of ISO New England, which is our independent system operator. You can think of them as the referee, so to speak, of the wholesale markets. They are an independent, neutral entity that administer the markets, and they review what are anticipated forecasted demands. How much power do we have on the system? How much power do we need in the next 10 years to make sure that we're hitting that demand? ISO New England is regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC as it's known. And so we have these regulated markets to make sure that the power stays on, it's reliable. Some parts of the country don't have RTOs or ISOs, and so they operate a little more independently. But what we found is these cohesive markets help us achieve savings and efficiencies. One way to think about if it's an ISO issue is, does this cross state lines? This is a really big energy project. Earlier, our speakers were focusing more on the distribution level. Things attached to your home, distribution level, it's run by the PUC. Things that are really big projects or cross state lines, that's administered by ISO New England. And it's a bit of a spaghetti soup of transmission system. It may look like we have enough power lines to power things, but we don't. In Rhode Island, we have our independent goals and our independent needs, but we also need to work with our neighbors. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the challenge of trying to go to areas where energy is produced and getting it into energy hubs like Providence or Boston where it's consumed, that's really challenging, and we need to be able to work with our neighbors. A study that came out earlier this year by ACORD, gave us, we're in an academic setting here, so I really don't love a low grade, a very poor score for our independent system operator, our area. And it wasn't just ISO's fault, it's also part of their evaluation was looking at how do states engage, how do the utilities engage, and a big challenge is that it takes a long time to get projects online and to add new transmission to the grid. On average across the country, it takes about 10 years for a new transmission line to be built. That's far too long. And again, we really stand out in terms of how we, add new transmission lines, which makes it that much harder to add the new good projects that we want to bring online. There's a lot of room to improve. The REPEAT project, which is part of a lab out of Princeton, found that 80% of the IRA benefits are lost if we don't expand transition. So Charles talked a lot about all the IRA benefits that we get. If we want to electrify everything or be intentional about what we electrify, we're not going to get there if we don't expand our transmission system. The other big thing I want to talk about is not just the wires to get the power. It's also interconnection, which is plugging in, so to speak, these resources into the grid. This is a sample of what the process looks like at the wholesale level. Interconnection is also an issue at the PUC level, the distribution level, but for now I'm just focusing on wholesale. There are several steps to get a new project proposed, approved, online, and at each phase of the process, it's an opportunity for a project to drop out. And right now, it's a very slow, cumbersome process. On average, again, it takes about 5 years for a new project to come online, to go from proposal to evaluation to approval and on construction and online. And that's an issue because, again, we need to have more of these resources. There's several costs associated with that and timeline challenges. Some good news is that if you look at this graph here from the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, about 10 years ago, a little longer than that, our installed projects were pretty heavily fossil fuel, a lot of gas, coal, nuclear, hydro. This is a national representation, by the way. This isn't ISO New England. And now you can see that there's some more renewables, but in the queue, as it's called, that line to get connected to the grid, there's a lot of clean energy pent up there. So much so that there's more energy projects that are proposed in the queue, waiting right now, than we have the wires to handle them. That's a huge mismatch. And so we can't connect these good projects without improving our interconnection process, but also making sure we have enough transmission to power them through. So we need to perform on both those counts to unlock that pent up demand. And so good news, there is progress. I had this slide up earlier, and just kind of iterated on it. So how can DERs play a role? They can manage our consumption when things are peaky. They can support affordability and create resilience. But getting there means we need to be intentional. Rich talked about engaging your PUCs, and he's absolutely right. We need to make sure that our policy leaders are prioritizing distributed energy resources and improving how we interconnect at the local level as well as the wholesale level. So I won't run through all of these, but there's some good things that are happening. Rhode Island recently announced a joint agreement with Massachusetts and Connecticut to cooperate on procuring offshore wind. That's exciting. There's a future of gas docket happening at the PUC. Before I came into the lecture today, I saw that the new storage report was just announced. And I want to make sure, does it go far enough or does it, entrench the status quo? We need to be incentivizing, encouraging more DERs. And at the more federal level, the FERC, again, which oversees the ISOs and RTOs, issued Order 2222, which requires ISO New England and other RTOs to think about DERs and allow aggregated resources to participate in the wholesale markets. So we heard earlier from the other speakers about how all of these different devices can work together. This is a way for them to come online and really help us manage our overall energy consumption and provide more value to the grid. Now on the wholesale side, how can interconnection and transmission help? We need to manage, our system demands, and we need to be able to unlock all of that pent-up demand coming from clean energy resources. So we need to understand the WON. We need to understand how these processes work and streamline where possible. We need to understand the attributes of clean energy resources because these markets weren't designed for clean sources. They were designed for coal, oil, and gas. They weren't designed for these broad, unique resources. And so we need to do some reforms there. And the one thing I want to emphasize, most right now that we can do in the short term is leveraging GETs, which are grid enhancing technologies. So again, transmission is hard because it takes siting, it takes land, it takes planning, and communities working together. But grid enhancing technologies leverage the existing infrastructure that we have. And so it is looking at what are the conditions on the grid? Can I actually get more capacity out of this? On a cold day, you may be able to run more power through that line than you initially thought. Or if you find congestion on the grid in one place, you can divert that power and use another line. It's making our grid smarter and more nimble using the infrastructure that we have. And so this is a good short-term solution, but it certainly doesn't replace the need for more transmission overall. And again, a lot of good activity here. Rhode Island and other New England states encouraged ISO New England to consider transmission and long-term impacts. And ISO New England today just gave a presentation about their Transmission 2050 study, thinking about how do we plan for the long term. We know that many New England states are expressing their demand for clean energy, but how do we make sure we have the infrastructure in place to serve it? So that's really exciting. There's funding and guidance coming in from the Department of Energy Resources and the Grid Deployment Office, which is great. And then finally, FERC Order 2023, which came out earlier this summer, looks at interconnection. And so instead of trying to approve projects sequentially, which is very slow, very cumbersome, very costly, it's looking at first ready, first served. So if you have a project and you have your permitting in place and your ducks in a row, you're going to move forward and accelerate. And instead of looking at each individual project, they're looking at groups of projects because it's groups of projects that are benefiting from the grid upgrade. So it's a more logical way to handle these projects. And I just like this quote from DOE from a report from 2020, acknowledging that if we go too fast, we might not build smart. We need to have input from folks to make sure that our investments are aligned with community interests. But if we go too slow, we will fall short and we will not be able to hit our targets and hit the goals that we've been talking about today. So I'll leave you with this. These are some just guide points, whether you're working at the local level, state level, regional level, across the country. These are things that I consider my true north to help me think about smart policy. Reliability and resilience, especially with more extreme weather events. We need a grid that is able to work for folks and stay online to make sure that we are able to have the lights on and stay safe. Equity and access, making sure, like again with the gas issue, we're not leaving communities behind and that we're sharing the benefits. And that also means sharing the costs. And so that when we do system investments, we're investing in a way that everybody's able to take advantage of this clean energy transition. We need to enable new market entrants. We didn't, when I started my career, storage was considered unreliable, impossible, too expensive. And now, some years later, it's a real asset. And so we need to be proactive and thinking ahead. And then finally, want to emphasize, I'm really glad that you're all here because we need your voices, we need community input, we need our legislators to be cognizant of these issues, as well as other elected officials. So there's a lot of work to do, but if we use these principles, I think we can get there. So thank you so much for your time and interest. I look forward to the Q&A.
Excellent. You don't need to look forward very long because we're going to start the Q&A now. I'd like to invite the panelists to come on up, and I am going to hand out the second microphone to Kaylin. And while they're assembling, I really liked many things that the speaker said, but I feel like something I'm still noodling on that Kat mentioned is, the status quo is the worst and most expensive option. I feel like people talk a lot about the cost of electrification and the cost of strategic electrification, but not the cost of the current day in the status quo. And I can also confirm that Kat does indeed talk about energy policy at parties, which I appreciate. So can confirm. I'm really excited. We have plenty of time for question and answer time. I'm really excited for this conversation. So what we're going to do is, if you have a question, we can only take questions here in the audience. So sorry for everyone who's live streaming. Please follow up with our speakers afterward. All of their emails were on their slides. But if anyone has questions, or I'm sure many of you have questions in the room, I will call on you, and then Kaylin you will get a microphone. Do not start asking your question until you have the microphone, or they can't hear you online. And I will call on you. So who has the first question? Yeah, in the sweater. I say in the sweater like that really distinguishes you from other people. Yeah, sorry about that.
Thanks, that's okay. So my question is sort of more specific. I think it's mainly directed towards Kat, but also touches a little bit on what Rich said, which is, it's really important that your house is connected to the grid, which I absolutely believe. But then, as Kat mentioned, sometimes the grid isn't ready. And I'm thinking of a specific example, actually, in Providence, where a school wanted to put a lot of solar panels on one of their buildings and was told, the grid can't handle it. You cannot do this. And it's a really interesting problem that a lot of people tend to think like, well, if you have a roof, you should have solar panels and it's all going to work. And that they don't think about as you point out, the wires under the street in this case. And so can you talk a little bit more about that and essentially when do you think they will be upgraded and what's needed for that? And will they then let that school know, like, okay, we've upgraded it, you're all good now? How does that work?
Yeah, I'm going to acknowledge that, Rich, you probably have some thoughts here because that's a distribution level issue. And if in a perfect world, that's how it should be. If, you want to upgrade, it's really transparent. The good news is that our grids are getting more visible. We are getting more information. We're seeing hosting capacity maps, which means how much wiggle room is there really in the wires. You know, if my neighbor puts on solar panels and adds EV chargers and decides to put in a bunch of big speakers, I don't know, they ramp up their consumption big time. How does that affect me? Like, for the most part, for small individual users, it should be an issue. But for a school that's a big energy consumer, that can be a challenge. And again, I say in a perfect world, because not everybody has those resources, they would have a dedicated energy manager that would be there to be a resource. And also, I see a role for, honestly, the Office of Energy Resources and other state agencies that should be there to offer guidance and support to entities that want to do the right thing and electrify. So I don't have a very satisfying answer, but like, we do need to keep up the pressure, and this is an opportunity where we as the public can and should go down to Jefferson Boulevard in Warwick, where the PUC is located, and make your voice heard to say that this is a priority. I want to have some visibility into how these issues are being played out and prioritize smart solutions, but I want to pass the mic to Rich because I want to hear your thoughts on this too.
The planning of the utility system and the planning of communities is disconnected, and that's a problem. There's a project right now in Rhode Island. It's really a national pilot project, not just a Rhode Island pilot project that the Office of Energy Resources is doing, and I get to play with it from time to time with the town of Johnston, where that town planner and Rhode Island Energy are cooperating on how might they talk to each other before there are urgent needs, identifying potentially especially the buildings that the town owns, but also other major users in the community, whether it's an Amazon distribution center or a big box store, just because those are the kinds of places that are prone to put some kind of significant energy investment into their buildings, not just public buildings. So if there's a dialogue between the town and the utility where this kind of thing can be anticipated, the utility can get a head start on thinking about provisioning not only the wires for the current capacity that they need to carry, but the substation further up. We used to design substations to think about what's the maximum that people would use for the current capacity that would come from the faraway power plants into the community. But now, the thing that is most risky for them is the amount of electricity the communities are generating that are going the other direction, that might burn out the substations from a negative direction in terms of how the power engineer thinks about it.
Yeah, I was just going to clarify for that. Yeah, the problem wasn't how much energy the school is going to use. They're used to that, right? The wire's already provided for that. It was how much energy they were going to produce and send back through the wires.
But not only through the wires into the community, but further up, and this is actually where there's the DERs and the wholesale market that Kat talked about are really converging. That the wholesale market is going to look at all the DERs as just as important as the nuclear power plant used to be. It's a gazillion of them equals one nuclear power plant, but that's still the way it's going to work. And so what we are still in the middle of in the United States is all of the people my age trying to figure out, well, everything has changed. Everything I knew to be true 10 years ago is not true anymore. And I don't know exactly how to adapt to the new things. Now, what I can tell you without taking too long is that the people at Rhode Island Energy are enthusiastic participants in trying to think about how the distribution system, and so you'll remember some of the same people who were on the Siri project that we did years ago are now involved with this. So there's a curiosity at the utility for how to make this work better, and so that's encouraging. But right now, it's an unsolved and significant issue.
Yeah, I was just I think those thoughts are just spot on. Are folks in the crowd familiar with the term integrated resource planning, IRP? Is that ring a bell to anyone? So IRPs are the resources looking at the generation, so solar, wind, but also your traditional fossil fuels, coal, gas, etc. There is something called an integrated distribution plan, and that's looking more at exactly your question. Whereas IRPs have been kind of tried and true in so many states for decades, integrated distribution planning is more. It's more on the frontiers in a relative respect. But I think part of this is how do we get more of these policymakers and regulators thinking about things at a systems level rather than at sort of a patchwork piecemeal was the word that you used level. And I think that kind of coordinating all of that into an integrated plan is super useful.
Awesome. And moderator's privilege, I'm going to also say, if this is a school in Providence, I think you said, I would love to talk with you afterward. The Providence City Council is about to introduce an ordinance to require all schools to be carbon neutral by 2035. These are the kinds of challenges we need to overcome. So let's chat afterward. I saw so many hands just now. I'm going to go in the black. Thank you, Lexi.
Hi, I had a question and a comment for policy-wise, but my question was, what steps are in the works to help close that supply chain issue? Because, for example, I'm sitting on a disaster, one of your examples of waiting until there's, a serious problem to fix something. And in this situation, we don't have enough power on the street or in the facility to power up 35 heat pumps. And so now we have the equipment, we're ready to go. But since the street can't handle it, we have 55 weeks to wait for the switchgear to come in. So you are in this constant cycle of, you're spending federal dollars, it needs to be spent by such and such date. You have the gear, now you have 35 units, they don't have heat. What do? The disaster sort of keeps circulating. So what kind of steps are in process to help kind of sort of close? If we're all going to go do that, and everybody else is going to go buy switchgear tomorrow, we're all waiting 55 weeks for this to happen.
Yeah, I mean, that, as you pointed out, that's a tremendous challenge. And it's not just around clean energy. I mean, we have an economy-wide supply chain issue. I think one thing that's particularly encouraging to me is if you look at after the Inflation Reduction Act was passed under the Biden administration, there's been unprecedented growth in terms of investment in new manufacturing facilities in the U.S. Across the country, blue states, red states, all over. To me, I mean, it's not moving at the pace that we need in order to sort of churn out a lot of these, frankly, across the entire clean energy issue. How many folks in the crowd are aware that we have a transformer shortage or know what a transformer is? Okay, we have a very, very aware crowd. This is impressive. To your question around the sort of transmission and distribution system, right? Like, transformers are a crucial part of how we actually expand and modernize the grid, but the waiting periods for these are several years, and it's kind of crazy. There are tangible things that folks who want to and can be proactive about doing. For example, you can envision a scenario where utilities really kind of collectively build a strategy around this sort of issue around transformer shortages. On the heat pump side, one of the big things is also making sure that the workforce and the contractor base is ready to, first off, that they know how to install a heat pump. Second of all, that they actually do a good job of doing that. That's something that we've seen in practice is not every project is done well. And part of that is you got to develop these workforce training and development programs. You got to do education, et cetera. It's all very complicated. The good news is that there is progress. The bad news is it's not fast enough, probably. And so it's just we got to continue to really accelerate.
And then just my comment was policy-wise, you had many sort of things that we're looking to hit as far as a state, and I feel like with Rhode Island we are so small, 1 million people. We could almost be our own pilot project for other places, and so for a couple of your sort of benchmarks you want to hit with the low income population and making this equitable. Rhode Island has 26 housing authorities, all with antiquated heating systems, housing our
state's most vulnerable population. And there's a real opportunity there to sort of set the standard, do energy efficiency products, spending those federal dollars, and then using that as sort of creating the policy to fund that, and then using that as your model for the rest of the country, which would then, like, you'd be able to hit those targets so quickly if you could just, like, in Newport, for example, it's 661 households. Great. Wow, we just did, like, you just did leaps and bounds to get to the next level.
If it's to happen that by 2035, all of the devices that cause climate change will be replaced with other things that don't do that, one strategy is to address low-income neighborhoods first. I'm very concerned that all of this progress will go to people who can afford it, and that other people will be left behind. But there's a simple approach to that policy people can decide that low-income people should get the first wave of these kinds of changes. That if we go to district energy or go to whatever, I went through several options to accomplish decarbonization of heating. But whatever one feels right, let's do it in low-income places first.
I think that's an incredibly important point, one that I wish that I had a chance to touch on more. How we heat and cool our homes, for example, with gas, let's say. This is unlike almost any other product that we purchase or consume. Fundamentally because how the decisions that you make actually impact your neighbors. It's not like, you buy a cake, you eat it, well, your neighbor has no impact, right? So if you get off the gas system, and this is the point, Kat, that you were making, as well as Rich, is you have fewer and fewer customers who have to pay for the same fixed costs of the gas networks. And those customers, if they are the lower income customers who stay on the system, there's a fundamental mismatch. They're already struggling to put food on the table as it is. How are they going to shoulder an increase in their energy bills? So there's a term for this. It's called the utility death spiral. It's not a new climate natural disaster. It's not a rock band. It's a pernicious issue of exactly this point, and that's why equity and from my standpoint is so particularly important to center around the building decarbonization issue. In part because it directly impacts American households in a way that many other aspects of the clean energy transition might not directly.
Awesome, thank you both. Okay, more questions. Yeah, you got your hand up first. Lexi, you're doing great.
Thank you. This is very informative. I really appreciate you taking time to present this. My question is there any guidance regarding decision making on when do you replace an appliances, a water heater, a car, a dishwasher, whatever the appliance is? I have a 2008 hot water heater. Does it make sense overall to replace that? When does it make sense to transition?
That's a great question. I want to encourage, if you haven't, everyone should request an energy audit. Rise Engineering is a sponsor of this talk, and they're one of the administrators of the energy efficiency programs. If you pay rates in Rhode Island, if you pay for an electricity bill, you contribute to these energy efficiency programs. And so you should benefit from these energy efficiency programs. And so my recommendation is to get an energy efficiency audit. It's no cost because you already paid for it on your bill. And they will make targeted recommendations for your home. And I say this as somebody who is going through this in my house right now. My house was originally oil heat. Before I moved in, they converted to gas. And we opened up the walls for renovation. There was no insulation, like you could see outside. And so that one was an easy fix. But to think about, well, what's the right size heat pump for my home if I'm still having steam radiators as the primary source? I want to think about lighting. I have I had knob and tube in my house. Like, I had a very unique situation. And so that's the thing. Our homes, our apartments, the places we live are unique to us, and they all have a story and a history. And so the audit is the first step I'd recommend. Rhode Island Energy, to their credit, has a lot of rebates and incentives and resources on their website. That's another great place to look. There's a lot of other resources online. One other place I would look to is the ACEEE, the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, has a lot of resources. I'm going to get a thumbs up from Rap. You know it's good. So I would start there. And I know I just rambled these off. If you want to email me, I'm happy to send these thoughts to you. But the audit is the first and foremost to get targeted recommendations. Rhode Island Energy's website, lots of good resources. And also, finally, the Office of Energy Resources has a lot of good links. They updated their site, and they have Rhode Island specific guidance and programming that might be relevant for you. I think it was last month the governor announced a new program to incentivize heat pumps in the state. So there's new programs coming out all the time. It's really hard to keep up with it. So use your state agencies, and use these programs when you can, because that's what they're there to do. They're there to serve you.
And to Kat's point, you can actually do the energy audits multiple times. You're eligible for it every 3 years. So I did them on my house a couple years ago. I actually just signed up to do them again, just because there's new programs and new incentives all the time. So what was cost effective 5 years ago is different than what's cost effective now. So, and the Energy Efficiency and Resource Management Council is one of the participants in today's event. And so very excited for the shout out to the EE programs. 100%.
One of the things that happens in an energy audit is the person comes in and they're expert and they run around and they do a lot of things and then they leave. If you take something away from this meeting, the policy stuff, I don't know if you're going to remember it, but you've got some questions that you want to ask these people. These people are really smart, they're experienced. Ask them these questions. Don't just let them go around and then give you a report. Press them on some of these replace or keep running decisions, and ask them about the indoor air quality issues that you've heard about. They are trained to have insight about these things. If you can engage them, that will make the experience better and give you the information that allows you to weigh what to do and when.
Awesome. More questions?
I'm just going to chime in on that audit thing. In case you weren't aware, and everyone at home, whatever recommendations are made as a result of the audit, the utility will cover 75% of the cost of. So when I had an audit done on my first home, which was only 880 square feet, they recommended $2,000 worth of retrofits. I paid I wrote a $250 check. I felt like I hit the lottery. It was really gratifying and amazing. And then, my bill, you'll be very jealous, was $25 because the envelope had been buttoned up, the ventilation was fixed. And so the other thing I want to point out is that if you are an income eligible customer, if you have LIHEAP, heating assistance, 100% of the costs of the retrofits are covered in Rhode Island. And part of the thing that we've been learning more and more about through this work we're doing with the ERMC is that very few people who are income eligible realize, for myriad reasons, that that's something that's completely covered for them. Of course, there's issues with landlords and, if they rent and things, but just to put that out there, we've all already paid on the surcharge on the bill. So to not have an audit of your home is silly. And everyone that works and does them are great people, fun to hang out with for a couple hours. So go home tonight and schedule it, because you'll be in a queue for 3 months, speaking of waiting.
Yeah, schedule it now. And if you're like me, you can cheer for them as they go around your house. Be like, "Ooh, you're doing great! What can I get for you?" So this is real. Okay, great job. Angela, did you have your hand up? Angela's next. Angela works with me at the Nature Conservancy, so I saw her hand. Former Energy Fellow, and right behind her is our current Nature Conservancy Energy Fellow, Rafid, who is today's paparazzi. He's great.
So hi, I'm Angela. This is a really great presentation. I enjoyed all three, and there's a lot of really good information here. I am really happy to hear people talking about the PUC in such a public education format. I think the scale and the weight of the decisions that are made at the PUC are a mystery to the average person. So I guess I would try to put us in a positive direction. What can people do to get involved either with the decisions being made at the PUC or at the very least be aware of what they're talking about, because there's a lot of really important decisions being made there.
Rich, do you want to take this one?
Well, first of all, I think at the Division of Public Utilities and Carriers, there's an 800 number that you can call to just convey opinions. If it's there for complaints, but it's also there for opinions. The division represents the public interest at the PUC. So the PUC is an administrative body. They sort of look like the three of us sitting up here listening. But the division is meant to engage with the public. And the public should feel it's okay to engage with the division. So that's one immediate thing that you can do anytime you want is call them. Now, sometimes there are opportunities that the PUC has for public hearings where people can come, and for the most part, people feel like, but my voice is just a little voice, and they're only going to give me 2 minutes anyway. So, but I really would encourage people to take these opportunities because the drumbeat getting louder is going in the direction of resolving these questions. I think a lot of places think like, well, maybe I don't have to resolve this right now. Okay. The term that we sometimes use derisively is kick the can down the road for a while. Maybe I don't have to take responsibility. Maybe my successor will have to deal with this. But you've heard us talk with some urgency, I would say, about some of the things that need attention soon. Maybe right now. Maybe last year. And so engaging with them at a moment when you have an opportunity, you have their undivided attention for a short time, and conveying this sense of urgency and importance is important. Now, occasionally, the PUC will do something that allows for a more of an engaged thing, where instead of them sitting up here and you're over there, there's actually sort of a round table and there's a workshop, and they can actually talk, and there can be some dialogue. This happens from time to time, and whenever that happens, it's great for people, but also for a lot of the important organizations that represent the public interest, the Wiley Center, for example, to be able to have an opportunity to deliver important messages. To the extent that you have any kind of membership in an organization, perhaps the Nature Conservancy, there's an opportunity then to deliver messages through somebody with some more significant and more routine standing. So there's lots of ways. It's not obvious. I get that. I used to be in charge of a state agency in another state, a smaller state, half the people from Rhode Island. But it was always important for us to find ways to engage with the public. And unfortunately, even in a small state, the PUC doesn't necessarily come down here to the southern part of the state maybe as often as they should. So for motivated people in the public, they have to go along with the opportunities that the PUC offers. But when they offer it, I urge you to try to figure out how to accept it.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that we started with a former commissioner. I think that covers so many of the bases. I would say there's to that point, it's hard to know. I mean, the fact that you all know what a PUC is already is a very encouraging step. So the way that I think about it is three key levers where I think your voice can be particularly impactful. One is the appointment of the commissioners. So there's about 200 commissioners across this country, about 80% of whom are appointed generally by the governor, in rare occasions by the legislature. In Rhode Island, the governor appoints the commissioners. And so if you're part of let's say you're a volunteer in an environmental or climate group, pay attention to those appointments. Those come up, every couple of years, and making sure that the governor puts in somebody who's very forward-thinking, smart, understands the issues, cares about the issues, centers, this sort of just and equitable clean energy transition framework. That's super important. The second is more on the legislative side. So a lot of folks may not necessarily appreciate this, but ultimately, at the end of the day, the PUC's statutory authority and their mandate is fundamentally dictated by the state legislature. That was the body that set up the authority of the Public Utility Commission in the first place. That's how we had the sort of investor in utilities with a regulator, aka the PUC. The state legislature can pass legislation that modernizes utility regulation. How does it do that? So I mentioned integrated resource planning earlier. Now, in the vast majority of states across this country, there is no requirement that the integrated resource plan consider climate change at all. So if that's sort of your motivating issue, let's say, make sure that you let your state legislators know that that should be on the table. There's this other thing called intervenor compensation, which some folks may have heard of. It's active in 6 states. That's basically this idea that if you're a group participating in a proceeding, you should get compensated, particularly if you're under-resourced. Third thing is exactly what Rich said is when there is dedicated public comment session, show up, participate, get informed of the issues, and make your voice heard.
I'll just be really quick because these questions are excellent and I don't want to repeat. But as a fellow Rhode Island resident, I'll just give you the rundown of places to look. You may not know, okay, when do I look at the website? I don't want to look at the PC's website every single day looking for public comment period. I don't even know if that's relevant to me. I want to echo something you said, Rich. It's like find an organization that resonates with you, and that is a great resource. And they will have on their websites or their call to action in their emails. So whether it's TNC, whether it's the Wiley Center, whether it's my former organization, the Green Energy Consumers Alliance, really involved in there. I'll take a page out of Sue's playbook and say, go to the EERMC. Before the energy efficiency programs go to the PUC for approval, they go through the EERMC, and that's a very accessible place to get up to speed on what the programs are, considering and when key dates are coming up. And then finally, the Office of Energy Resources too. They have a great Twitter presence and a good website. And so there's often when there's big happenings at the PUC that OER is following, you can go on their website and have a quick cheat. And so I encourage you to find organizations that resonate with your values and your interests. And that can be a nice, easy way in to understand how to break into the PUC because it is a bit of a monolith, but it doesn't have to be.
I'm just going to add real quick, too. The PUC has some really wonderful staff who are really wealths of information. So if you do have questions, there's folks like Todd, there's Senior Director of Policy, Cindy, Emma. There's some really great staff level folks who, I have found are just if you ask them questions, you get so much amazing information. And they see so much information coming through them. And sometimes I find the PUC website to be less than accessible. But if you're oh, I'm wondering where this is, they'll be okay, if you look at this docket, page 54 of the questions, you're okay, someone help me find this. Because otherwise it can be a little inaccessible, but they're really, really helpful. We are on our very last question. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. Oh gosh. Okay. We're going to do a little eeny, meeny, miny, moe situation. Man in the front, your hand went up first. Oh, unless you didn't have a question anymore.
That's me.
Oh, you have the. Oh, I can do it. Here we go.
We all should recognize that when the sun goes down, solar goes to sleep. It's the same kind of time when the sun goes down when a majority of in the future or even now electric cars get plugged in to get charged. There's to me an obvious generation issue. What are your concerns there?
If there's no policy from the state through rates or other ways, we could have a huge problem because there could be a lot of demand on the grid right after the sun goes down, as you point out, and the utilities will do what they need to do to spend the money to provision the grid to serve that demand, and it will cost a lot. And we could end up with a future where we've decarbonized, but rates have gone up a lot, and it didn't have to be that way. So a different future is a lot of the things that some of us talked about relate to how you all, as any member of the public that has a car or a heat pump or a thermostat or a lot of different devices in the house that can be grid responsive, can become smart users, especially if there's energy storage in the house, but that's not critical. The idea is to manage the usage so that it doesn't actually happen during that dusk period, that it can be shifted to another time of the day. And because the grid is smart, because the devices are smart, there's all this digitalization that is allowing these devices to be smart and the system to be smart. You can get the performance that you're looking for from your car or from the heating system, but not stress the grid at that critical moment or that critical 2 or 3 hour period. And then, if that can become institutionalized across millions of houses across New England, we don't have to build a grid to serve that hypothetical future where everybody's doing what they want and there's no insight or intelligence in how they're doing it. Instead, we're going to build a grid and a modern house and a modern business and modern places where people go, where those things are built in, and that insight and intelligence is guiding the grid to not use power when there's a lot of costs that would otherwise occur. And in that way, the costs are avoided. There's going to be a lot of electricity used. We're going to use twice as much. I don't know what the multiple, if electrification works out, we're going to need twice the amount of electricity that we have now, or maybe it's 1.5 times. I'm not sure. It's a lot more. But it doesn't mean that the infrastructure needs to expand in the same way, because, as I think you said, we're thinking about, maybe you said, that's right, you said it. We're going to think about using the infrastructure that we have. This stopped.
Are we getting cut off? Yeah, this turned off too.
We're gonna figure out how to use electricity in a more sensible way because of all of it. And that's a key
It's really
thing.
weird.
What do we all think about that? Are we willing to let intelligent systems with controls that
Or
match
unintelligent.
our stated desires, our stated behaviors? Lexi's interested in behavior. This goes directly to the kind of work that Lexi wants to do after she gets out of here, is how do we build our behavior and our preferences into these systems?
Rich is working again.
How do we build our behaviors into these systems so that it's not a burden for us to help the system manage all of this change in a way that minimizes the cost instead of maximizes the cost?
I also want to briefly add, this is an important question. This is why I think of energy resources as like a healthy diet. We need variety. This is why we shouldn't rely on a single source. We can't and shouldn't just rely on solar. Just like we can't and shouldn't just rely on natural gas. When Winter Storm Elliott hit, we thought gas was so reliable until all of a sudden the pressure was unreliable in the system and we had issues getting it from point A to B. And you know what saved the day? It was renewable energy across the region. It was incredible. And so this is why I'm excited about wind, both onshore, but importantly, offshore. We are having, I'm sure you've read in the paper, some delays and some issues. And again, we've had issues with every new technology and resource type at every juncture. But I'm optimistic about offshore wind. We in Rhode Island are the first in the Western Hemisphere to have our pilot project off of Block Island. That's huge to celebrate, but that was a little while ago. So again, I'm excited about offshore wind. We need to work with companies and our state policy leaders to get those into the ground. But in the meantime, we do need to be considerate of reliability issues and how we balance the system to meet our energy needs. That's absolutely right.
I'm going to close with two cool, innovative things that I would encourage folks to check out more. First is time of use pricing. So to your point, we should change the rate structure so that you're not paying the same amount, the same any time of the day, but for something like later in the day where everybody wants to turn on their electricity, it actually costs more to generate and transmit that unit of electricity at that time. So you should be paying more. Now, that's not a bad thing if it means that actually you can also have the flexibility of shifting your load. So maybe you don't turn on the dryer at that time, and with a smart energy infrastructure feature, maybe you don't even need to make that choice. The digital device makes that choice for you. The second is virtual power plants, or VPPs. This is a term that refers to aggregating all of these distributed energy resources that we've talked about today, and it acts effectively as a physical power plant, except it's not. It is the combination of your heat pump, your rooftop solar, your electric vehicle, your battery storage system, and they create more flexibility to the grid so that, let's say I'm going on vacation and I'm not at home, but I have a rooftop solar system. All that energy, maybe it'd be nice if I could get credit for that and ship it effectively to my neighbor. Now, I'm not literally sending the electrons to my neighbor, but I'm getting credited for the electricity that now my neighbor can use. That is that solar energy. So when I think about kind of a positive vision for a clean energy future, it's exactly that. It's one where, when you wake up in the morning and you sort of turn on the stove or the coffee kettle, it's all reflected in all these machines, and devices are smart and talking to each other in a way so that things like what you're describing, the risks of those are minimized, and that we have a clean, reliable, safe, affordable, healthy future.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Can we take a moment to really thank our panelists for the amazing lecture tonight? I love that Charles ended with two innovative, wonderful things. So I'm going to just end with one innovative, wonderful thing, which is the Energy Efficiency and Resource Management Council. So we've referred a few times to the energy efficiency programs that exist in Rhode Island. These programs are actually our very largest policy to deal with climate change in Rhode Island currently. They're more than $100 million of programs per year funded by the ratepayers, and you can all take advantage of them. And they also have a lot of oversight. And so it's not just a large program, it's one that a lot of thought and consideration has gone into. And the Energy Efficiency and Resource Management Council, that's like a really long name, you guys, we're working on a rebrand. Provide some of that oversight. So we're a group of stakeholders representing different sectors. So I'm on the Energy Efficiency Council representing the environment sector. We have some architects, we have folks representing large users, we have folks representing small users, some residential folks, really evaluating these programs every year before they go to the PUC for approval. Say, are these good enough? Are we meeting goals? Are we setting the goals strong enough? Are these programs that are going to help everyday Rhode Islanders? And Rhode Island businesses. And you can learn about the ERMC on our website, which is rieermc.ri.gov. It's a mouthful, you guys. We are working on a rebrand. But if you just Google Energy Efficiency Resource Council Rhode Island, it's like the only thing that pops up. You can also attend our meetings. And we actually have one tomorrow at 3 p.m. And the great thing about our meetings is they're both in person. If you like in-person meetings, they're at the Department of Administration building on Smith Hill in Providence. They're also on Zoom. So you can just be like making a snack, folding your laundry, learning about energy efficiency at the same time. Super recommend it. They're really interesting. And then public comment is always welcome. There's always time for public comment at the ERMC meetings, but you can also submit public comment online in between meetings. And Steve, who's here from the Office of Energy Resources, staffs those meetings and always reads that public comment out loud. So it gets recognized, it gets heard by the whole council. So if you can't make a meeting, your schedule doesn't allow for it, you can still submit comments at any time through the website. So I'm now going to turn it over to the wonderful Kate, who's going to wrap us up.
Thank you. This was one of the best lectures we've ever had. I'm feeling really energized at the end of the year. So we'll have to keep the momentum going. Couple things, really smart people. They're talking about stuff that may have left you somewhere else. We have some, everyone look in the back of the room where it says URI Cooperative Extension. There's 3 pieces of paper upright with QR codes. Thank you. Thank you, Vanna. So each piece of paper is a resource from the organizations that our speakers represent, all of which Lexi, Kalen, and I found incredibly helpful to read to prepare for tonight. And so I'd encourage you to just snap a quick pic of those QR codes on your way out. There's a guide to how the Inflation Reduction Act is going to help you as a consumer. I already printed that out for my family. But take advantage of those resources. If you registered tonight, you will receive a survey. Thank you for filling it out in advance. And you are now, unless you opted out, will now receive URI Cooperative Extension communications about other events and workshops that we offer, all with the goal of bringing science to you. So on behalf of Kaylin Keene, who stays quiet but is one of the masterminds behind this, Lexi Zabo, who is ending her energy fellowship this year, which we're really sad about, and myself, thank you very much for coming. We'll see you next fall. Thanks. Energy fellows and speakers, could we come to the front, please, for some photographs? All right.